Commissioner Davis, and if you could introduce everyone on your team that's here, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And unless someone else has walked in, I'm joined by Director Jim Gillis, Director of Government Affairs, and my Chief of Staff, Drew Vetter. So, Mr. Chair and Madam Vice Chair, thank you. Mr. President, I think he stepped out. Madam Vice President Middleton, thank you. Senator Conway, Delegate Anderson, thank you. And for all the council members, I hear your remarks. I respect all of your opinions. I think sometimes good, thoughtful people will occasionally agree to disagree, and I respect your perspectives on this. I really, really do. Councilman Pinkett, your remarks particularly resonated with me, so thank you, and again, thank everyone for the thought that you've put into this. And I said this informally on a number of occasions over the past week as we've all discussed this bill, and what I said to people is at least we're talking about this. At least we're talking about this. So thank you. For logical reasons, people in Baltimore overwhelmingly assume a few things when it comes to illegally possessing a gun. The first assumption is that it's a felony. It is not. The second assumption is that illegally possessing a gun is a violent crime. It is not. And the third assumption folks make is that there are mandatory sentences upon conviction. There are not. I've spoken to people like you all have around Baltimore who are shocked that the simple illegal possession of a handgun, which in our city is an act of pre-murder, is a misdemeanor offense that will more often than not result in less jail time than a person arrested with 10 rocks of crack cocaine in his front pocket. And I know there's a lot of discussion about nonviolent drug offenses. Let me make one thing clear to everyone. This isn't about mass incarceration or locking up more people. It's about holding the right people accountable and putting the right people in jail. This is anything but zero tolerance policing. And I think I've demonstrated over the last couple of years that I am adamantly and publicly opposed to any and all things zero tolerance policing. That's what got us in this predicament to begin with. In Baltimore, the right people are those who want to harm you, your daughter, your son, your neighbor, our community. There were 318 murders in 2016. 84% of those murders were committed by someone using a handgun. As of today, and Councilwoman Middleton is right, there was a murder, a drive-by this morning in her district. As of today, there are 196 murders in Baltimore, 196. 86% of the murders this year have been committed by someone using a handgun. There have been 379 non-fatal shootings in 2017 as well. There have been over 1,490 robberies this year committed by people using a handgun. It's a problem. Baltimore does not have a problem with those people who legally possess a handgun killing people. It just doesn't happen in our city. Our problem continues to be those who are illegally possessing handguns and all too often face no consequences for their actions. This is important. 46% of our victims killed since the beginning of 2016, 46% of our victims have been previously arrested for gun crimes. Those are our victims. 41.5% of homicide suspects have been arrested for gun crimes in the past as well. How many of them could have been saved by a better system? And I agree, there are many aspects to a better system. It goes far beyond the police. Since January 1st of 2016, there have been over 605 convictions in Baltimore for gun-related crimes. And again, as a reminder, a conviction by a judge or a jury requires a threshold of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. 60% of those 605 convictions, 60% have resulted in suspended sentences. That's a problem. A few examples. Take Ivan Johnson, for instance. Ivan Johnson was charged and convicted of a handgun-related offense on July 13th, 2016. He received a 3-year sentence, but had 2 years and 8 months of that 3-year sentence suspended. He then went on to commit a non-fatal shooting during the time that he should have been serving in jail. This story is not unique. Take Dwayne Torrance. There was a murder last week in the Southwest District at the Sunoco gas station. Just last week, I was there. Dwayne Torrance was charged and convicted of a handgun-related offense and sentenced to 3 years on April the 20th, 2015. He had, of that 3-year sentence, Dwayne Torrance had 2 years, 11 months, and 29 days suspended from that 3-year sentence. He was arrested for murder last week after he shot 2 people on July 17th, killing 1. Take Sean Williams. Sean Williams was charged and convicted of a handgun-related offense. He was given a 5-year sentence on April the 17th, 2017. Of that 5-year sentence, Sean Williams had 4 years and 3 months of that 5-year sentence suspended. Sean Williams was himself a homicide victim when he was killed by gunfire on June 18th of this year. He should have been in jail. He'd still be alive. Take Daquan Holbrook. Daquan Holbrook was himself a non-fatal shooting victim on May the 24th, 2016. Non-fatal shooting victim. He was charged and then convicted of a handgun-related offense on January the 24th of this year. After he was charged and convicted, again, proof beyond a reasonable doubt, he was given a 3-year sentence and had 2 years and 8 months of that 3-year sentence suspended. He was just arrested again a couple weeks ago on June 28th for another handgun-related offense. A couple more examples. Steve Feldman. Steve Feldman was charged and convicted of a handgun-related offense on June 25th, 2015. He was given a 1-year sentence but had 11 months suspended. Feldman is a suspect in a non-fatal shooting that happened on May the 2nd of 16 and has since been arrested for another handgun-related offense when he should have been in jail. Gerard Stevenson. Gerard Stevenson was charged and convicted of armed carjacking. On February the 22nd of this year. He was given a 5-year sentence, but had 4 years and 7 months of that 5-year sentence suspended. He has since been shot. Last month, on June 11th, Gerard Stevenson was shot. He should have been in jail. He wouldn't have been shot. The issue of judicial discretion for gun crimes in Baltimore was highlighted by the Curtis Steele case, and we all sadly know this story. Curtis Steele, 2 handgun-related arrests in the month prior to his death. And the third time he possessed a firearm was when he pointed it at a Baltimore police officer and was shot and killed. The people who are getting out of jail for gun crimes on suspended sentences.
Sir, order. Pursuant to Council Rule 7-2, the audience will stop disrupting this meeting.
But you said they had a time limit.
Pursuant to Council Rule 7-2, the audience will stop disrupting this meeting. Agency officials do not have a time limit. The next step is individuals who are going to be removed. The next step, I'm going to say this one last time. The next step is individuals will be removed from this council meeting. Please do not make me do that. Please let him finish. Commissioner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The people who are getting out of jail for gun crimes on suspended sentences have been arrested an average of 9.34 times each. I know there's a lot of thoughtful discussion on first-time offenders, and I embrace that thoughtful discussion, but the people who are receiving suspended sentences, of the 605 people, they've been arrested an average of 9.34 times each. James Dorsey. James Dorsey was charged and convicted of possessing a firearm with a felony conviction. Already had a felony conviction, got a new charge of illegally possessing a firearm. He was given a 10-year sentence. Of his 10-year sentence, he had 9 years, 9 months, and 23 days of his 10-year sentence suspended. Mr. Dorsey had been arrested 27 times in his life. Kevin Gardner. Kevin Gardner was charged and convicted of illegal possession of a handgun and given a 3-year sentence. Kevin Gardner had 2 years and 10 months and 10 days of his 3-year sentence suspended. Kevin Gardner had been arrested 20 times in his life. Offenders do not view the illegal possession of a handgun as a serious crime because there are no serious consequences. The state generally preempts local governments from regulating gun crimes, and there are only 3 exceptions to this rule: with respect to minors, with respect to law enforcement, and with respect to places of public assembly. This local ordinance makes it a crime to illegally possess a handgun in or within 100 yards of a church, park, school, public building, or place of public assembly. And I'll gladly entertain questions about those geographies and how we determine such places. Being arrested, prosecuted, and convicted of this crime would lead to a 1-year jail sentence. The jail sentence would not be suspendable. I want to address something right now. The discretion that Mr. Ralph spoke about still lies with the prosecutor. The prosecutor has the discretion right now. And the first time an assistant state's attorney has to look at the merits of an arrest is at central booking. So a police officer makes an arrest for the illegal possession of a firearm, takes the person arrested to central booking, and immediately there's an assistant state's attorney who reviews the merits of that case. So that's the first opportunity the state's attorney's office has to either bring or not bring that charge. And then the state's attorney, her office itself, has a gun violence enforcement division, and they secondarily review the merits of that charge to determine whether or not they want to bring that charge into a courtroom. So those are 2 already existing levels of discretion. We are prevented from making this a felony as a local ordinance or imposing more jail time because we've not been expressly granted this power by the General Assembly. We've been to Annapolis going on 3 years now trying to do this. My first time a couple years ago was with then Senator Catherine Pugh, now Mayor Catherine Pugh, and we have not been successful in Annapolis. We now have the ability to do it here at the local level. So any conversation about this being a knee-jerk response to the violence, and I understand the anxieties that violence brings to our entire city, but we've been talking about this for a while now. Laws are about controlling behavior, and that is what I hope this will do. We simply can't wish our young men to put down their guns. We have to do something about it. This is just another tool of many, many tools in our toolbox to keep violent people out of our neighborhoods. It's not a silver bullet. It's not a panacea. And any assertion that it is simply a distraction technique. We do not believe that this is the end-all, be-all in violence reduction. It's a tool. Again, our goal is to ensure that the right people are behind bars. And as I conclude, if you're convicted, proof beyond a reasonable doubt in a courtroom, the mandatory sentence will be 1 year. It's not a mandatory minimum, it's a mandatory sentence. Again, this is a local ordinance that is not comprehensive. Our crime plan and crime strategies are holistic. For example, we're one of 5 police departments in the entire country that has adopted law enforcement assisted diversion. It's an immediate diversion opportunity that we give to low-level drug offenders in our city. Only 5 in the country do this. It's an alternative to an arrest that we very progressively adopt. We're going to announce later this week our crisis intervention teams. It's a blended approach of cops and mental health professionals riding together in the same police car who will be dispatched to those calls for service that apparently indicate someone is in some type of mental distress. And we have an opioid overdose task force as well. So we're about as progressive as they come in terms of how we're addressing these long-standing issues. Baltimoreans who I speak to consider it a violent crime to illegally possess a gun, even if our state does not. And I want to mention one thing about drugs versus guns. Being addicted to drugs is often not a choice. It's something that happens to a person in his or her lifetime, and it's a condition that many, many people struggle with. But making a decision to illegally possess a gun is a choice. And it's a choice that far too many people in Baltimore make every day because there's no consequence when they're caught and successfully prosecuted. So I again thank the committee for your favorable consideration. I respect all the opinions and perspectives and experiences that you all possess, and it's an honor to present this to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. At this time, the committee's going to entertain two amendments. Well, there may be additional amendments. The first amendment is introduced by Council Member Bullock. That should be on our colleagues' desks. This amendment deals with two things. Essentially, one, making this not apply to a first-time offense, and number two, the exception to that would be when in connection with the commission of a crime. Is there a motion to move that amendment?
You mean to adopt it?
Or to adopt that amendment, yes. Is there a motion for that amendment?
So moved.
So moved by Councilman Pinkett. Is there a second?
John.
May I say something for lack of a second?
Yes.
What-
Second, but
I've just asked for an interlinear copy of that very amendment, and so that we can all better understand it. I've never seen it before today. I'm not, is this a motion to adopt it?
this is yes, to adopt the bill with this amendment. That's correct.
I think it sounds like a good amendment, but I think we need to make sure we understand what it says. Can we ask the councilman if he would describe it to us? This is
Absolutely,
a
Councilman
little early in
Councilman
the
Bullock.
session to be adopting amendments.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, as I mentioned before, I have concerns about this legislation or its proposed bill as it's currently written. And as it's currently written, I cannot support it. So the points that I have, they're similar to those that are voiced by many who have testified today and also have reached out to our office. So one is the impact on first-time offenders. I believe it would be tragic for a young person with no criminal record who made one mistake to be faced with such a consequence. Second is the impact upon those who simply fear for their safety and are not committing any other crime. So it's in that spirit that I offer the following amendments, which are actually on my colleague's desk. Essentially, the one-year sentence would only apply to those who possess an illegal weapon in the commission of a crime or who previously have a gun offense. And if you want me to read would you like me to read?
No, that's all right, Councilman. So there was a motion for the amendment by Councilman Pinkett. There was a second by Councilman Stokes. We're going to do roll call.
John.
I'm not ready to.
Yeah. I have a question.
Yes, sir.
I have a question.
I'm
Question.
telling you that to wait and
Question.
until we.
Moving the amendment.
Okay.
Yes, Councilman.
I just had a question related to the amendment. So, in the amendment, it says, and I guess that's Article 1, if the handgun was worn, carried, or transported in connection with the commission of a crime, mandatory imprisonment for 1 year, and a mandatory fine of $1,000. I guess my question would be, and I don't know if it'd be formed in an additional amendment to the amendment, that crime can be specified as a crime against person or property.
You know, I think we need to get that addressed, and we can address that with the law department. And I think it would be appropriate to consider that as a subsequent amendment to Councilman Bullock's. And I think Councilman Pinkett's asking for clarification on person versus property. And what I was saying is I think that's a worthy dialogue to have, and that should be that we should have that dialogue, and that should be considered in a subsequent amendment.
Certainly.
Councilman Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, in the light of what Councilman Pickens said, and in the light of the conversation that we've been having here today and for a long time in Baltimore, I would suggest that we either add to this amendment, even though we know I'm not a supporter of this bill, but we should add to this amendment that this bill, if passed, and I hope that it doesn't, if passed, actually state in the legislation that this that it only applies, since we are preached to here about violent repeat offenders, that this bill applies specifically to those who have been previously convicted for a crime of violence in the city of Baltimore.
So, Councilman, we have a motion and a second, and we've already entered roll call. I think the committee should have that dialogue around exactly what you said, and we will consider that in a subsequent amendment today after discussing that with Department of Law in detail to address your concerns, Councilman. just as Councilman Pinkett's. So we have a motion by Councilman Pinkett. We have a second by Councilman Stokes. We are going to do roll call. Costello, yes. Clark?
I'm voting yes, but I would like to say the following. This, in terms of amendments, I've read this over. I'm not quite sure what it means, but it goes in the right direction. It doesn't mean I'm necessarily voting for the bill, and I would like the rest of the amendments, please, to be together so we can see them and everyone understands them, and not do it basically in the middle of what is a hearing process. But I will vote yes on this motion in courtesy, and because it's going in the right direction as best I can understand it.
Thank you, Councilwoman, and we will certainly get with both Department of Law and Legislative Reference. If someone from the Council President's office could grab Thaddeus from Legislative Reference, that would be greatly appreciated. And we will start working on an interdelineated version as you requested.
And of that and any other amendments, there are 3 amendments on our desk at the moment. This is one of them.
Oh, I got 2.
And if there are any others coming in, we should interlineate the whole bunch so we can all see what a bill would look like.
So any amendments that are passed will be included in an interdelineated version. Back to roll call. Bullock?
Yes.
Pinkett?
Mr. Chair, I'm supportive of this amendment, and I thank Councilman Bullock for his leadership in drafting this. But I do believe that during the course of this hearing, we would not be doing our due diligence unless and until we clarify and specify what crime is as it relates in this amendment. So I'm voting yes, but with the expectation that we will define what crime is.
Thank you, Councilman. Reisinger? Yes. Scott?
C.
Yes or no, Councilman?
Yes.
Stokes? Amendment passes. The chair will entertain a motion for a second amendment introduced by Councilmember Costello on behalf of Councilman Yitzi Schleifer. That amendment should be on your desk, and that has to do with, this is really a technical amendment for clarification. It inserts the word illegal as well as the word handguns. Councilman Schleifer, do you have any comments before we entertain a motion on this amendment?
No, I'll just state this was at the request of some constituents who were not clear on the bill because it was regarding handguns in proximity to certain locations and some of the examples that were given. I think Councilwoman Sneed gave an example, or maybe it was Councilman Burnett, about somebody who was driving with it in the truck. And so just clarifying that we're talking about an illegal gun and illegal possession of a gun rather than somebody who's legally obtaining a gun.
Thank you, Councilman Schleifer. Is there a motion to move that amendment? So moved by Councilman Reisinger. Is there a second? Second by Stokes. We'll do roll call. Costello, yes. Clark?
Yes.
Clark, yes. Bullock? Yes. Bullock, yes. Pinkett? Yes. Pinkett, yes. Reisinger? Yes. Reisinger, yes. Scott? Yes. Scott, yes. Stokes? Yes. Stokes, yes. The amendment passes.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment I would like to propose that I have submitted this morning, since that's what we're doing. This is, doesn't mean, none of this means how people are voting, but this is a vote, this is an amendment, and it's easy to understand without even reading it. It says that if approved, this legislation will, however it is coming out, will remain in effect for 2 years. At the end of that period, with no further action by the mayor and city council, this ordinance will be abrogated and of no further effect. In effect, it contemplates that after 2 years, it ends from the date of enactment.
Excuse me. You're out of order. This is the last time, sir. If you do it again, you're going to be removed by the police. Councilwoman, I apologize
It
for
is,
interrupting.
at that point, it can stay dead. There should be statistics gathered on what happened or not, and then a council can decide whether or not it wants to reintroduce it. But this is emergency legislation. Let's treat it that way. I would like to move that, and I would ask my committee colleagues for their support.
Second. Second.
Was there a motion?
Mary Pat made
I
the motion.
moved it.
Second.
Second by Councilman Scott. Let's do roll call. Costello, no. Clark,
Yes.
Bullock,
Yes.
Pinkett. Yes, Councilman.
And this is to my colleague, why 2 years and not more?
Because by that time, we'll have, this thing goes into effect upon enactment. That's in the bill. That means the mayor signs it, it's in effect. And therefore, it starts right away, and there would be 2 years from that date, and I wrote it to be 2 years. By that time, if we haven't come through this, then we need to take a look and see what's happening. So that's why. In other words, why not what was proposed by the General Assembly? Because I think we don't need to wait that long to figure out the kind of data that tells us what's happening because of it or not. That's all. I would appreciate your support.
Mr. Chair, I just wanted to add
Go ahead.
that 2 years, as opposed to, say, for example, 3 years, 3 years would take us past the primary election for the next term of the mayor and city council, and it would seem that it would make sense for this to be something that would be settled before the next set of mayor and city council candidates went before the voters.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilman Pinkett?
My vote is no.
Pinkett, no. Reisinger? Reisinger, no. Scott?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Councilwoman, thank you for this amendment. The only thing that I would change about it is that maybe we should make it a minimum of 1 year sunset on the bill. My vote is yes.
Scott, yes. Stokes? Stokes, no. This bill fails, or the amendment fails for a lack of a majority.
Thank you, colleagues. For your consideration.
Just want
He wants to amend the amendment that just failed.
Are you good? Councilman Scott?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I stated earlier, we all know that my opposition to this legislation is firm. But while we're in the spirit of offering amendments, I again would like to think that we should consider, and I know that you said we discussed this with the law department, we should consider adding into this bill, in the vein of what Councilman Bullock did a few moments ago, that this apply to those arrested in violation of this ordinance who have been previously convicted of a violent crime in the city of Baltimore.
Thank you, Councilman. Are you offering an amendment,
Yes.
or are we going, is that something that you want to talk about
Second.
throughout?
I'm offering it.
Councilwoman, hang on.
That,
Take a deep breath. I'm just asking for clarification from the councilman.
Yes, sir. I'm offering that as an amendment, sir.
It's on the floor.
So there's an amendment from Councilman Scott. There's a second from Councilwoman Clark. Is that correct?
Yes, I would ask that my that the lead sponsor restate so that someone can write it down.
Yes. That should be you, Madam Vice Chair.
Councilman Scott, if you
Yes, sir.
could you please repeat the amendment?
Yes, sir. Would like to amend the legislation so that persons caught in violation of this ordinance, it only applies to individuals who have been previously convicted of a violent offense of violent crime in Baltimore. That's it.
Okay,
Mr.,
there's, hold on,
I want
hold on.
to
There's
say why I support it. It's on the
Councilwoman
floor.
Clark, we will get, you can justify your vote during roll call. There is a motion by Councilman Scott. There is a second by Councilwoman Clark. We will now go to roll call, and if colleagues would like to justify their vote, they may do so during roll call. Costello, no. Clark.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, this gets to the heart of the matter for many, many people. We talk about violent, repeat offenders. We talk about them all the time as the core, as always have been, of the gun problem and the violence problem. Yes, they have their younger people who are followers, but these are the leaders. These are the kingpins. If there is going to be a mandatory sentence in this city, let's make that go along with our own rhetoric and language about violent repeat offenders. You want to go after them, then vote for this amendment and make this bill about what we talk about and think about all the time. I vote yes.
Clark is a yes. Bullock?
Yes.
Bullock is yes. Pinkett?
I believe that this bill, or this amendment, should be broader than just violent crime. It should include crimes against person and property, so I say no.
Pinkett, no. Reisinger? No. Reisinger, no. Scott?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to state before I vote that if this amendment doesn't pass, then all the rhetoric, everything we've been told about everything involving violence and violent repeat offenders in Baltimore is just that. It's just talk, because that's not what our actual focus is. I vote yes.
Scott, yes. Stokes? No. Stokes, no. This amendment fails for a lack of majority.
Peace, please.
Colleagues, moving forward, if there are any more amendments, I'm going to ask that they be written down. I will note that in the email I sent to everyone on the council yesterday evening, I specifically said, if you have proposed amendments to the bill, please have them drafted by legislative reference. It's certainly okay to offer up amendments on the floor, but we need to have them drafted so that there's clarity in the instance that any of these amendments are passed, so that we can get that exact language to Thad from legislative reference, who's here with us now.
Mr. Chairman, a point of order just before we go forward. We're a little out of order, but I would like to make a point of order. We need, in writing, in proper format, the amendments that we have just adopted. Now, so that not only we, but also...
Councilwoman, you have the two amendments in front of you. We've agreed to have an interdelineated version of the bill created. Legislative reference is working on it as we speak. I've already acknowledged that point about 5 minutes ago. Your point is duly taken.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We need to get back to an orderly process. And will there be an opportunity for any of the committees or councils further amendments? I don't have any. I'm out of this one. But any further amendments should come in written form by legislative reference, and if they're coming and we need to wait for legislative reference to write them, we wait, so that we can get this back on a track of everybody knows what's going on in the proper order of when it's going on. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman. So to address your point, as previously discussed, any new amendments that come in will require to be in writing. Council rules do not require that those amendments be drafted by legislative reference, even though I asked for that last evening. Moving forward, if you have an amendment, it needs to be in writing. The amendment can be considered, and we will have legislative reference with us. Councilman Pinkett.
Just for a point of clarity, as far as in writing, we're talking about even when there are, I guess, proposed amendments to pre-drafted amendments. You still want those in writing?
Yes, Councilman.
Got it.
Thank you.
One more thing, if I may, Mr.
Councilwoman.
Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, the reason I indicated legislative reference, much as they are overworked, understaffed, but certainly capable, is the following. Language is everything. In the beginning was the Word, and in the end is the Word. And therefore, we need to know not what a person like me writes on a piece of paper, but what Thaddeus and legislative reference translate into the legislative language of what I said, so then we see what it ends up saying, which can not always be the same thing. Therefore, that's why I indicate that. I don't know about what the rules say, but this is, if we're doing all this now, today, we need to leave knowing exactly what we did in the proper language, and I hope that legislative reference will work with us on that as we will work with them.
Councilwoman, your point is noted. I doubt that, but your point is noted. Commissioner Davis, we're now going to take questions, or I'm going to ask that you take questions from the council. First up is going to be Councilman Cohen, followed by Councilman Pinkett. Colleagues, I would just like to remind everyone, as we discussed at the beginning of the hearing, if you could please limit your questions to a total of 2. If you have more questions than that, we will get to you on the second round of questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Commissioner Davis, for your service. I think I'm distinctly, and I could be wrong about this, but the only person on this council that has been the victim of a violent gun crime. And so I bring somewhat of a unique perspective. A few years back, I was robbed in my bedroom with a gun. It was incredibly traumatic. The result is that I still suffer from PTSD. What I see in many of our communities is a deep level of trauma that people are experiencing. And when I was robbed, my immediate response was I wanted a gun, even though I am not a gun person by any measure. So I worry that one of the collateral consequences of this will be more incarceration of people who are victims of crime and victims of trauma, and people who are attempting to defend themselves in some of our most underserved neighborhoods that have been underserved for decades and centuries by this city. And I wonder, I have 2 questions. One is, how will this be enforced? How can we assure that this does not result in racial profiling or in stop and frisk or in any of the policies that we know caused this crisis that we are now dealing with in terms of mass incarceration? That's my first question, is what's the plan to enforce this, given that there is already a law in our state that if someone is convicted of a crime using a gun, they go away for 5 years. So how do we know this will not result in increased racial profiling, increased stop and frisk in the neighborhoods that are already underserved by our city?
Okay, so thank you, Councilman, and I'm sorry that that happened to you. I really am. So this isn't, victims of crime right now are not being arrested, and this bill is not going to prompt arrests of victims of crime. This isn't an enforcement bill. So, for instance, I've had a couple questions from council members, you know, how will this change what the Baltimore Police Department does on a daily basis? And my answer is, it doesn't change anything we do whatsoever. This is a bill that will ensure that a 1-year sentence is served if, and this is the big if, and I just encourage everyone to pay attention to this, if an arrest, a lawful arrest is made, if the prosecutor at central booking decides to go forward with the charge, if the state's attorney's office decides to go forward with the charge upon a secondary review before it lands in a courtroom, and if the threshold, the burden of proof of beyond a reasonable doubt is met inside of a courtroom. So there are various levels of accountability that already exist. I think when folks hear the word mandatory, they assume that there will be an enforcement strategy adjustment by the BPD. There will not whatsoever be any adjustment in how the BPD does business. This is on the back end of a conviction.
But if we're not if we're acknowledging that we're not consistently catching the violent repeat offenders, the bad guys with guns that are terrorizing our communities, then how? Again, my question is, unless there is an explicit enforcement mechanism, how will this legislation work?
Well, Councilman, I don't know that I acknowledge that we're not catching bad guys with guns. We certainly don't catch all bad guys with guns, and I'd be glad to be put out of business one day. But this bill is simply a mandatory sentence upon conviction in a courtroom. So it's not just the police that decide if someone will have a mandatory sentence imposed on him. It's an arrest. It's a lawful arrest that meets prosecutorial review favorably, so their office can go forward with a prosecution. And then it's up to a judge or a jury to convict or not. But upon conviction, it would be a 1-year mandatory. And I think one of the statistics that I gave you, and I apologize if I threw too many at you at once, but the folks who are getting their sentences suspended right now in Baltimore average 9.34 arrests apiece. So I do understand, and I too read the Baltimore Sun article where they opened their article with examples of folks that we all kind of talk about and worry about. The trucker, for instance, I think Councilwoman Sneed talked about a potential circumstance of constructive possession. Right now, the prosecutor's office has the ability to apply discretion now to decide whether or not to pursue. So what will happen more often than not is the state charge will go forward all the time, and on occasion, this local bill will be applied to the defendant if the prosecutor's office agrees that it meets all the requirements of the local law.
My final question, Commissioner, is I used to teach many children of incarcerated parents. We know that violence is cyclical. We know that kids who have parents who've been in prison are more likely to end up in the carceral system. Is the school system, is the health department prepared to deal with the consequences of having more kids growing up without parents in their homes from this legislation? And I understand that we have a violence crisis and that the murder also takes away parents, and that is completely unacceptable, and that this is an attempt to solve that. But when I look at our school system, which is already incredibly strapped for resources, when I look at our health department that is incredibly strapped for resources and is trying to deal with a profound mental health crisis, both in opiates and in trauma, I worry that this legislation will compound those crises and will result in more kids growing up without parents. And I just wonder what effort has been made to coordinate with all of our other agencies that are going to have to deal with it.
So, Councilman, I understand that thought. And so just speaking narrowly about this bill, the folks who are convicted now of illegally possessing a firearm and the folks who are convicted in the future of illegally possessing a firearm, they're not victims of crime. they're perpetrators of a crime. They themselves are not victims. So when we talk about the impact of violence, I haven't heard a whole lot of discussion, and maybe it's because we're here narrowly focused on this bill, about the victims of violence right now in our city. And the young men who choose to carry a gun, and again, I think it's important to state that choosing to carry a gun is not an addiction. It's a choice people make to do it or not to do it each and every day. The folks who are being victimized like you were in your bedroom with a gun stuck in your face, the folks who are being shot and killed or shot and maimed, they and their families are crying out for us, government, to do something to hold convicted, not accused, but convicted offenders more accountable. And that's all this really is. It's not going to result in mass incarceration. And I think we can probably agree to disagree perhaps on whether 1 year mandatory is cruel or unusual. We probably have different opinions about that length of time. But when you talk about other jurisdictions that have had failures in mandatory sentencing around gun crimes, and I think Councilman Burnett referenced that, and I'm familiar with some of the things that went on in South Carolina, and I think Florida, and I think Maine. Well, their mandatory sentences were 10 to 20 years. We're talking about 1 year here, and we're not talking about ammunition. We're talking about guns, and we're talking about convictions. So I just think that in spite of all the conversation that needs to accompany this body and this hearing, I don't want to lose sight that we're talking about people who are convicted, not accused, convicted, and they're not victims of crime. They're perpetrators. And that gun that's in my waistband, I'm a young man with zero to little conflict resolution skills. Our young people, our young men, are choosing to resolve petty conflicts with gunfire, and we see it all too often. And I know we're all here with the same end goal in mind. And I think it was Vice Chair Clark who said, we have one goal in mind. We probably have different ideas about how to get there, but I think this is a necessary bill to give some favorable consideration.
I would just say that we are all deeply concerned about the victims of violence, but also their children as well.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Thank you. Councilman Pinkett, before I get to you, and Commissioner, please forgive me, we have one other elected official who's here, Delegate Cheryl Glenn from the 45th District, who is the chair of Maryland's Black Legislative Caucus. Delegate Glenn. We're gonna get back into questions with Commissioner Davis. We appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Commissioner.
Oh, sorry.
Councilman Pinkett, sorry.
Thank you, Commissioner Davis.
Councilman.
I want to say first and foremost that I believe the majority of the Baltimore police officers are exceptional public servants, and they uphold their position with the highest integrity. But in light of the several recent indiscretions committed by sworn officers, in reference to this bill, what is your message to a public that has questions about trust and the credibility of the police department?
So, Councilman, I fully understand that, and since mid-2015, I have done my very best to bring a culture of accountability to an organization that hasn't always embraced the necessity of police accountability. I fired 23 police officers last year. Since I've been the police commissioner, we've lost one administrative hearing board or trial board, and they're now open to the public. So there's a lot of things going on to improve accountability. We list all of our police-involved shootings on a recently developed transparency page. We list all of our policies and procedures as it pertains to use of force. There isn't a police department that's doing more with accountability than us. So when things happen, like the recent allegation, the planting evidence allegation, I share the concerns about that allegation just like anyone in Baltimore. When we arrested and federally indicted, and when I say we, because the BPD did it along...
You're out of order, Commissioner.
Along with the BPD and the FBI work together to indict those 7 officers who have forever disgraced our profession, our agency, our city. I get it, but this isn't about a new enforcement tactic. This isn't a new police strategy. This isn't a new directive that will be given to cops. People who are charged and convicted in a court of law upon a very lengthy and existing prosecutorial review system, who are convicted of illegally carrying a gun, would face the consequences of this bill. So I understand the anxiety of the timing of it all, particularly when you have such a serious allegation, a planning evidence allegation. There's no more serious allegation than that. That's being investigated, and that's being investigated thoroughly, and I'll call balls and strikes on that, just like I have with every other investigation since I've been here. But there's more than one thing going on in the city that demands our undivided attention, and this bill is just that. Police officers will not be given the direction or the authority or the power to do anything differently than what they're doing now as it pertains to stop and frisk, arrest, or anything else regarding our interaction with people who possess guns illegally.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilman Scott.
Councilman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Commissioner, thank you for your service to the city of Baltimore. You guys have spoken a lot about the sentences that have been reduced by the judges at their discretion. Do you guys have a list of those sentences and the actual amounts of time served for all of the 600 and so that you mentioned?
We do.
Could you guys provide that to the committee? I think that that's important information for us to have when making an informed vote. And secondly, Mr. Commissioner, so as you know, gun arrests in the city are down 31% as of the 15th of July, 643 versus 937, and handgun violations are down from 622 to 455, and that's down 27% to be exact. Can you provide to us, of those, let's just say for handgun violations, of those 455 handgun violations done thus far this year, how many of those individuals will we consider are VROs?
We can. And Councilman, for the first time in the BPD's 233-year history, beginning in January of 2016, we started tracking all these arrests. And I know how important data is to you. It's important for us as well, but we can get all that to you. But in terms of our arrests, gun arrests being down this year, this isn't about arrests. This is about outcomes for people who are convicted of illegally possessing a firearm. And if you look year to year in terms of gun arrests, we were up significantly in 16 versus 15, and now we're down about 30% in arrests in 17 versus this time 16. But again, this isn't about arrests. This is about outcomes.
Well, yeah, you know, for me, it's never about the amount of arrests. It's about the who. It's about the quality of the arrest, and that's why I specifically asked to see the amount of VROs that are being arrested with these gun violations, because, as we know, it's a small group of people that are committing the overwhelming majority of the violence in the city. And if this legislation is gonna be being pushed, we want to make sure that these are the people that are being arrested already. Because if VROs are not the ones being arrested today, then they're not gonna be arrested once this goes. And these arrest numbers and percentages aren't gonna change drastically, like you said to my colleague. This isn't gonna change the strategy. The strategy is gonna be the strategy for the police department. But we would need to ensure that we are making sure and targeting the right people. And those, we know who those are, and those are the violent repeat offenders. And Mr. Chair, I'll pass the buck for now. I have more questions later.
And Councilman, thank you. And the hypotheticals that I've been given, we're not arresting, charging, convicting, sentencing people on their way to BWI, people on their way to compete in a shooting event, people on their way to an antique gun show. You know, when those exception to the norm circumstances arise, and the Baltimore Sun identified 2 or 3 of them. I wish they would have spent more time on the majority of the rest and the nature of those majorities. But when those special circumstances arise, the constructive possession, the trucker who makes his way into the city unknowingly or unaware of our gun laws, discretion already exists for the state's attorney to apply. And it's my belief that the state's attorney will exercise her discretion and not apply this local bill to those exception to the norm circumstances. They rarely arise, They rarely arise. I just want to be clear. They rarely arise. But when they do arise, the prosecutor's office has the discretion not to apply this local bill.
Thank you, Commissioner. Councilman Scott, you good?
I have more, but you said 2 at a time, sir, following the rule.
Thank you. Councilman Burnett.
Thank you, sir. I will also keep mine at 2, but I have plenty more, so just put me at the bottom of the list. So thank you, Mr. Commissioner, for coming before us today. So I want to start with you've used the statistic, 60% of these trials have resulted in less than a year. Is that kind of
60% of convictions?
Yeah.
The sentences have been suspended 60% of the time.
Okay. So is there anyone on your staff that is in the courtroom or following these cases one by one that could kind of speak to the line of questioning that I'm going to have here today?
I don't know what your line of questioning is going to be, but I think maybe we initially share our data with you.
Okay.
And the data may address some of your questions.
Okay.
And if not, we can have a more direct.
So basically what I'm trying to understand is we're saying we're putting the onus on judges to give a longer sentence, not suspend the sentence, give it the 30-day minimum that we already have, et cetera. But my understanding of the court system is that also requires the police department to provide evidence before the court that the judge would deem sufficient to prove that the defendant is guilty. So what percentage of that 60% was the result of inadequate evidence? What percentage of that 60% resulted in the BPD arresting someone for a case but not actually having a weapon? And the reason, I'll say the reason I'm asking that question, and maybe your intel has heard what I've heard, in that a lot of violent repeat offenders are saying, I'm now going to give the weapon to a child to hold for me, which is another issue that we can discuss further on this committee. But you work with the state's attorney to build a case. So I think it's a little disingenuous to basically put out here that it's judges who are solely doing the wrong thing and not take into account the collection of evidence, which we know gun arrests are down. So we know that 30% of the people you were arresting before are now not being arrested for having a weapon. Therefore, cases are not being adequately prepared. Can we say that is possibly true?
Councilman, if I can just address a couple of your questions, remarks, and I'm disappointed that you think my remarks are disingenuous. I really am. But I'll say this, because this is...
Commissioner, who was that, Shorty? Who was it? No, Shorty, I don't want to throw you out. That's the last time that we're going to interrupt anyone for the duration of this hearing. I know. I'm interrupting because I'm the chair of the committee and we don't have order in the chambers. Sir, I'm going to ask you one last time. Please stop. Commissioner.
So, Councilman, we are talking about all the data and all the numbers. We're talking about 605 people who've been convicted. If inadequate evidence was presented at trial, either by the prosecutor or the police, it would not have resulted in a conviction. So there are cases, gun cases and other cases, that result in not guilty verdicts or acquittals. There are cases that result in dismissals. Maybe I'm not explaining myself. I'm talking about 605 people who have been convicted with the legal burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. They've been convicted. So there's been a lawful arrest, there's been a successful prosecution, and a judge or a jury has concurred that the evidence is sufficient to convict. If the evidence were insufficient, they wouldn't be part of the 605 people. So of the 605 people that I'm talking about, 60% of them have the sentences that they were given by a judge suspended. And that's why and I apologize for taking up too much time when I was given a litany of examples. People are being given sentences upon their convictions because they are in fact guilty, and that's been a conclusion of our criminal justice system. Their guilt has been a conclusion of our criminal justice system, and upon sentencing, their sentences are suspended 60% of the time. When I talk to people about that across this country, my colleagues in other big cities, they're floored. They're floored that that happens, and as are most Baltimoreans.
Thank you. My second question, and I'll come back to that. I don't want to beat that point to death. Is so we mentioned sentencing, and we mentioned you said there's convictions, and you have a dissatisfaction with the length of time. And for the record, for people who are violent repeat offenders, so do I. But we are sitting here just under 200 murders. And I did some research myself and found that the average sentence for first-degree murder in the state of Maryland is 17 years. Average sentence, and we're welcome to debunk that. This is what I was able to able to put together. But I would imagine it's about right with the conviction. Second degree, 9 years. We also already have state law that has mandatory minimum sentencing for possession of an illegal firearm and the use of violent crime, and with narcotics, right? No lawyer, but those are already on the books. So the understanding of this bill, which I'm guessing was something that you put forth, since you indicated that you have presented this to the state unsuccessfully, which I think I have other questions about why you didn't start with this body first, but that's a different topic. But if the idea and the logic, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that this would remove violent repeat offenders from the streets, but also serve as a deterrent for others to carry a weapon. If the sentence of 17 years for murder, which is the intent when you fire a weapon at someone, you intend to kill them, I would imagine, never done it, but the intention is to murder that person. So if the prospect of serving 17 years in jail, a life in jail, whatever, you mentioned other jurisdictions saying 10 years mandatory minimums, 3 years mandatory minimum, 7 years mandatory minimum, 5 what we already have on the books. If none of those things have deterred nearly 200 murders, can you please explain to us why 1 year would do that?
Well, Councilman, it's I understand your statement, and I understand that it's posed as a question. I respect your opinions. I imagine that those 17 years and 9 years is actually time served versus sentencing years. Nonetheless, what's happening now, and I can go through the examples again. If we don't hold accountable those who illegally possess a gun, they more often than not illegally possess a gun again. And when they illegally possess a gun again, they're shooting and killing other people, or, and this is a reality that I think I used in a couple of my examples, they are being shot and killed themselves. So 1 year, and we could agree to disagree whether or not 1 year is cruel or unusual. I don't think it is. So 1 year serves a dual purpose of holding that person accountable who's convicted, not accused, not suspected, no hunch, convicted. There's an accountability piece to that that I think the community expects. And then there's a life-saving measure to being off the streets for 1 year, because all too often, angry young men who can easily possess a firearm, and that's a totally different discussion, and we'd probably be on the same page about the accessibility of firearms in America. It's one of the curses of our country. And when people ask me how many guns there are in Baltimore, I have no idea. Too many, way too many. But holding folks accountable who are found guilty, I think, is what this bill is all about. And I know we're having a lot of conversations about, you know, the dad who's convicted and spends 1 year away from his family for that dad's decision to illegally possess a gun and get convicted. But what about the mother, the dad, the mom who spend the rest of their lives without their son or their daughter because they were murdered? We're not having that discussion. And I think it's because of those mothers and fathers that I visit and that you visit and you interact with all the time that we're here offering this bill. And if state law hasn't done it, I don't think it's just appropriate for us as leaders to throw our hands up and say, well, Annapolis can't do anything for us, so we're not going to try anything different. This is just an exploration of a bill that can do something potentially different for the state of violence in the city.
Thank you, Councilman. Commissioner, I just want to go back to the case of Mr. Ivan Johnson. That individual was arrested for handgun on person on May 20, 2016. Is that correct?
So I got a few examples here. Ivan Johnson was charged and convicted of a handgun-related offense, and that conviction was on July the 13th of 16.
Right, but he was arrested in May. He was found guilty in July. He was sentenced to 3 years with all but, or with 2 years and 8 months suspended,
Yes.
and then committed an armed robbery and then killed someone in October.
Yes.
So if Ivan Johnson was given the 1 year mandatory sentence, that individual that he shot and killed would still be alive.
Mr. Chair, most of the people that I've used as examples who received suspended sentences, if they did in fact serve the duration of their sentence, either would still be alive or wouldn't have taken someone else's life. And that's why I offer them as examples.
Yeah, and I just want to focus on that one example because I'm not going to belabor and go through, I know you gave 10 or a dozen examples, but in the case of Ivan Johnson, the individual that Ivan Johnson killed would still be alive. Not only that, but Ivan Johnson would not likely be going to jail for the rest of his natural life because he wouldn't have committed that murder had he been in jail. Is that correct?
Well, Mr. Chair, and I don't want to get into because for all these examples, the accountability piece serves a dual purpose of accountability, and it in fact protects those people from the lifestyle that they've chosen to lead that involves the illegal carrying of guns. So yes.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you for your service to the city. We have gone through Cohen, Burnett, Pinkett, and Scott. Do any of our other colleagues have questions? We're joined by Councilman Dorsey from the 3rd District. Councilman Dorsey.
Councilman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I really want to express my thanks for Councilman Burnett's questions regarding the role and the blame that is being cast on judges for the circumstances that we face. I believe that reality-based accounts of history do not support the notion that incarceration in general helps to reduce violence, and that judges and prosecutors are sworn to pursue justice in the interest of the public good. And so it seems reasonable to believe that judges who exercise great reservation in sentencing to jail time are pursuing justice and public safety as best as possible. Given the circumstance that jail time does not result in greater, but rather in the long term lessened public safety, heightening the likelihood of future recidivism. So for you, I have just a simple kind of yes or no question. Is it possible, in the opinion of the police commissioner, that just maybe this legislation might possibly do the exact opposite of what is intended, that over time it could possibly result in worse conditioned and lessened public safety?
So, Councilman, with all due respect, you don't get to decide on the length of my answer to your question. So it's going to be more than one word, respectfully. What this bill is intended to do is hold people accountable who are convicted in a court of law after being arrested by the police, prosecuted by the state's attorney's office, and found guilty by a judge or a jury. This bill is an effort to ensure that those folks are held accountable so Baltimoreans don't have to be on the receiving end of gun violence based on their decisions to illegally carry guns in our neighborhoods. That's my answer.
So was that a yes or a no?
It certainly was not.
Excuse me?
It was not a yes or no answer. It was my answer.
Then I'll take that as having not had the question answered by the police commissioner.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Councilman Burnett and then Councilman Scott.
Mr. Commissioner, earlier you stated that this would not change policing strategy.
Enforcement.
Enforcement.
It would not change our enforcement strategy.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
So can you describe how officers will, when making arrests, measure the distance of 100 yards from a park, church, or any other public space? Will they be carrying measuring tape to do this?
Councilman, fair question, in spite of your quip at the end, fair question. We have a map that we already have preliminarily drafted of places that we think qualify. We're going to have to do a lot more work, and we're going to have to develop a system where at central booking we're able to demonstrate to the assistant state's attorney that the arrest, if the local bill is to apply, meets the criteria as outlined by the local bill. So
can I follow up on the map point? That's the first I've heard that. And so are you indicating that you have already outlined which communities will be impacted by this? More disproportionate to others that may not be in that map?
So we'll be glad to share with you a map along with the other data that we've been collecting of places that we think, and we're not identifying them by community, we're identifying places throughout the city that we believe meet the criteria of public gathering place, church, school, park, etc.
So, Commissioner, can you provide, or Jim, can you provide a copy of that map to Paul and I, and we'll disseminate that to the council? Thank you.
Absolutely.
And
And
so
Councilman, it's in draft form right now, but we'll be glad to share it.
And I have concerns about it, but I'd wait to see it before expressing those. But I'll say the notion that we've identified certain parts of the city where this would apply, and therefore likely to result that where you live puts you at greater risk, whether you have a legal firearm or not.
Well, I don't know if that's a question, Councilman,
Sure,
but
it's
if
a
you're
statement.
at a
I
public
do have
gathering place or a church or a school
Sure.
or any other place as outlined by this bill,
And the reason I ask is there are parts of my
Councilman,
district
if
that
I
are
could
that are
ask you just-
a lot of churches, public spaces, some that don't. But to the other, I'll leave that one alone.
Okay.
The other question I have is we've given examples of people, of victims who would still be alive should had this law been in effect. My understanding of how, and again, I am not a police officer, but my understanding is that when an arrest is made, regardless, possession, distribution, whatever that is, that someone within that criminal organization is likely to replace that person in that act. So, for example, if there's an arrest made, when you guys get arrested for possession or whatever it is, distribution on a corner of Mount Holly and Edmondson, I don't think the other dealers then say, I'm not going to stand here on the corner and fill that vacuum. And so I would argue that this point made that more people would be alive is very presumptuous, considering the fact that we know there is likely to be someone else to fill that role of muscle, of a lookout, of a dealer, of a distributor. All of these things we know these folks will replace these folks, because the reasoning for doing those acts is largely, we can go into the whole thing around economics, we can go into the whole things around health and mental health, but you are arresting a large quantity of people for the same crimes, so that would insinuate that there is someone replacing that person.
Councilman, I apologize, but I have to ask if you have a question.
What is your strategy to stop folks from filling the vacuum that is created when you make an arrest?
well, Councilman, I appreciate again your statement. I also appreciate your dedication to holistic things that need to happen throughout government and throughout nonprofits, businesses, schools, et cetera, that address the sad reality that when we do make an arrest of a drug dealer, when we do make an arrest of people involved in gangs, there is often, very sadly, someone else who will step up to fill that vacuum. If that should deter us from making arrests, then we'd be in a sad state. That's not acceptable to society, to not make an arrest because sadly
I'm not implying
else.
that you should not make arrests.
Okay.
What I'm saying is that this.
So I think the
things that
holistic,
you mentioned that
the
people would still
holistic
be
approach.
alive,
I mean, we're here narrowly focused on this bill. The holistic approach to public safety And that's the correct term. It's not law enforcement, it's not policing. The holistic approach to public safety is something I think that you and I and Councilman Scott probably are really close to agreeing on wholeheartedly. This is a narrowly focused bill that we think will hold young men accountable for making a decision to visit our streets every day with a gun in their waistband.
Thank you, Councilman. And last question, Councilman Scott, before we get into public testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Commissioner, I would start off by saying that I agree with your sentiments that as far as policing and laws go, the state of Maryland has failed us over the years. Of course, to me, that also is another reason why they should not be in control of the police department, and that power should rest with the city of Baltimore solely, for the record. But to get back to my earlier point, as you know, today we have 196 homicides. A few years ago in 2011, we had 197 total for the year. And during that time, we had a focus and a comprehensive approach to reducing violence in the city of Baltimore. And today, we were told that multiple times that this legislation is just a piece of the pie. Well, we're being asked to vote on a piece of the pie when there is no pie. Well, we've never seen the pie. But more importantly, Mr. Commissioner, I just can't go back. I have to go back to the gun arrests and the handgun violations. And two questions. One, it's my opinion that this also, for me, and I want you to try to clarify this, that this could also sometimes be prohibitive for your officers to do their jobs. And I'll give you an example. Let's just say I'm in Chum or Bella Edison, and you and I both know who the VROs in that area are. And let's just say that one of the officers from Northeast District sees one of them run a red light, stops the car, and when he gets to the car, it's two people in the car. It's the VRO, and there's a 16-year-old. And all of a sudden, the 16-year-old is the one with the gun. Today, what would happen is that your officers and the state's attorney would use the threat of jail time on that 16-year-old for us to get the big fish, the person that has 10 bodies on them. If this bill passes, that young man's not telling us anything. It's going to be hard enough to get him to tell us something today because we all know he's going to be putting his life on the line, his family's life on the line. But do you think that this bill could also hurt your officers' ability to do their job in cases like that where we need to get the person that's really having the bodies on them, the one that's doing the violence? And I just wanted to talk about that.
So, Councilman, I understand that scenario as you present it. I think this new bill will give the state's attorney's office and the police department more leverage to, in fact, get that information to avoid those constructive possession cases. And constructive possession cases should concern all of us, especially all of us with teenage sons. And that's why I'm convinced that our state's attorney, Marilyn Mosby, and her staff will not pursue charging this local bill for any circumstance that remotely comes close to the one that you just described. And I get that circumstance that you just described, and it would not be my expectation that this bill would be applied to that circumstance. Hopefully that's the best way I can answer that.
And lastly, Mr. Commissioner, this is not for you to respond to, and this is just a addition on to what my colleague Councilman Burnett said, and he's a little nicer than I am, as everyone knows. The legislation, the way it's written, shows that the police department is going to have to enforce this in different ways in different places, because churches and schools only exist in abundance in certain neighborhoods in Baltimore City. So there's no way for them to enforce it in any other way that picks, like the commissioner said, neighborhoods to have it, because if it's only illegal around these places, the bill only applies around these places, and these places only exist in abundance in certain neighborhoods in the city, and typically they're in neighborhoods with people that look like me. We know that they have no choice but to enforce it that way, and that's another reason why this version of this bill is very bad. Thank you.
And Councilman, I'll just say this, the reason why this bill is not applied to the whole city, and we would love it to be applied to the whole city, is because the General Assembly only allows us to apply it to churches, parks, public gathering places to say. That wasn't a Baltimore decision. That's a Maryland General Assembly.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you for your service to the city. And Mr. Gillis, you'll be sticking around for the duration of the hearing in case we need anything from BPD.
Mr. Chair.
Next up is the state's attorney.